Good morning. I'm going to keep us moving along. I am John Bruce. I'm faculty here at the New School. I also serve as the director of the MFA in Transdisciplinary Design program at Parsons School of Design. I'm very honored to and sincerely excited to be serving as the moderator with our next group of distinguished guests for this next portion of today's program. Carbon. The singular word carbon provokes in really unique ways. Carbon is elemental, it's foundational, and it also plays a complex role in our present moment, indeed. It can be counted in certain ways, it counts in certain ways. It raises these notions of in what ways might we touch issues surrounding carbon within complex systems. It's a thing, while its thingness begs our urgent attention and creative intervention. Our distinguished guests today invite us to consider radical and new perspectives of our relationships with carbon, with nature, and with the potential of a post-consumption, post-fossil extraction future. So allow me to introduce our guests. We will hear from each of them and afterward engage in a discussion following their presentations. Charlotte McCurdy is an interdisciplinary designer. She is a Global Security Fellow at the Rhode Island School of Design and a member of the New Museum's curatorial incubator, New Inc. Charlotte's research covers a wide swath of her interests, including climate change, biotechnology, food security, human-computer interfaces, and system design. Andrea Lips is Associate Curator of Contemporary Design at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Most recently, Andrea has curated the exhibition Nature, Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial, and edited the publication Nature, Collaborations in Design. Nature is on view now until January 20th, and I encourage everyone to visit this uniquely provocative exhibition. Julia Lohman is Professor of Contemporary Design at Aalto University and founder of the Department of Seaweed, an interdisciplinary community of practice exploring seaweed as a sustainable material of the future. Through her work, she investigates and critiques the ethical and material value systems underpinning our relationship with flora and fauna. The work of both Charlotte McCurdy and Julia Lohman is featured in the exhibition Nature at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, again, which is curated by Andrea Lips. Again, I encourage you not to miss this fantastic show. Please welcome our distinguished guests.
Hello, I am very excited to be doing some work continuing to set up our conversation on carbon. And in particular, I hope we can spend a few minutes together thinking about what we really mean when we say we need to reduce carbon and when we sort of set a goal of decarbonizing our culture. So, climate change is terrifying. We're all there, right? Often it's paralyzingly terrifying. So sort of building out of the conversations we've already been having, how do we get to that paradigm shift that Laura was talking about and get to accepting and changing? Materials have a really amazing role to play in that. So generally when we talk about climate change, we talk about burning fuels to produce energy. But from a technological perspective, those emissions are solved, right? Solar and wind are cost competitive. Battery storage tech is like on the verge of breaking through in the next few years. What is left after we solve that, after we're in this magical world where all the barriers and obstructions fall out of the way and that technology rolls out, is a third of emissions that don't come from burning fossils, but from using fossils as materials or from tearing down rainforests and the embodied carbon in the rainforest. Quick up, so that third. Quick update is that the IPCC just released new refinements on the ways in which we're asking countries to measure, capture, and define this cut of emissions for the first time since 2006. So like the data supporting this cut of emissions is like about to get much clearer, which is super exciting. So super quick, materials most complicit in climate change. We heard a little bit about cement. It's the biggest one, 8%, but also steel and plastic. These materials are carbon emitters because they are made of fossilized life like fossil fuels, cement being made from limestone, which is made from fossilized coral and marine shells. So we live, as we've discussed, in a like petrochemical, fossil-based material culture. The carpet under our feet, the paint on these walls, the Tylenol you might take, they're all made of fossil fuels, and they're all complicit in climate change. But if we start to think more systematically about carbon, we don't need to take those materials away from culture. We have an opportunity to change which carbon we make them out of. So I like to think about carbon in terms of sunlight. So until about 150 years ago, this is a quick photosynthesis diagram. Until about 150 years, we met our needs for light, heat, transport food and materials with the sun. You have to remember here that food, wind, wood, and falling water are all just secondary effects of the energy of the sun pummeling their earth. But in the last 150 years, we've built a dependence on ancient sunlight. Fossil fuels are also the stored energy of the sun. Carbon is incredibly good at forming atomic bonds that store the energy of sunlight into chemical potential energy. And when we use fossil fuels, we're releasing that stored ancient sunlight. This is a quick nerdy dive. We talk a lot about the flows of carbon and how we're taking it, we have a net flow into the biosphere. But this is a sort of over-the-top infographic that I made about where is the carbon in the reservoirs as they are. So each sea is an atmosphere's worth of carbon, 720 billion tons of carbon. Projectors are terrible, sorry, 72 DPI. All the way up in the top. Do I have a laser? I have a laser. No, I don't have a laser. One sea, tiny sea, we're justifiably terrified by the marginal changes in that amount of carbon. Biomass, terrestrial plants and soils contain 3 times as much carbon. Tearing down rainforest is bad, has bad ecosystem effects, but it also means that the embodied carbon of that landscape goes somewhere, and it goes into the atmosphere. That faint bar you might see is the ocean. We all sort of vaguely have a sense that the ocean is a really important buffer for the greenhouse gas that we're emitting. It causes acidification of the ocean. But those top 3 lines, that's the short-term carbon cycle. That's the carbon that we used to build society off of. And then we start to get down into fossil fuels, 6 times as much carbon as is in the atmosphere. This big green section are carrageenans, the precursor chemicals to fossil fuels. We already heard a little bit about fracking. Same way that we figured out how to take formerly uneconomically viable hydrocarbons and make them economically viable, we can burn this potential energy and make use of it. Then we get into the lithosphere. Whenever we make cement, we're tapping into this. This is the second page. It's hard to see. So this is potentially an incredibly depressing slide because it points to the amount of damage we can do, and also that, as we've already heard, this is not an issue of running out. This is an issue of deciding how we use our carbon, which carbon, where we want to take it from. This is my last nerdy slide. So this is Geologic Time, the history of the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. I point this out to say that we're not the first form of life to change the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. I really don't like not having a portable mic. That moment, that's the Carboniferous Period. That's the period we get 90% of our coal from, and it's an artifact of the fact that plants developed the ability to produce lignin. So we went from a landscape of ferns to trees for the first time. But it took 100 million years for bacteria or fungi to figure out how to break down lignin. So trees grew, fell over, accumulated, and that's where we get our coal from. And Hominids, all our little mammal-y lives, are in this very low tail. We've evolved into a world that we were given by photosynthesizing life by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So focusing quickly on plastic in terms of ancient sunlight. This looping GIF is very distracting, but you can think plastics are just big, long chains of carbon atoms, right? And they're very dumb, pretty much. Most common being polyethylene, polymer, multiples of monomers, big, long chains. Right now, conventionally, we make them out of hydrocarbons. We make them out of fossil fuels. But when you start to sort of take this bigger picture on the fact that all these materials are fossilized life, that they are just sunlight being stored in these molecular bonds, creates the opportunity to think about the potential of present tense sunlight, present tense photosynthesis, as the basis for meeting our material needs. So in my work, I got really obsessed with this question of what it would feel like to live in a society that was back in a present tense relationship with the sun. This is an extension of the question of how can I live petroleum free? It's impossible right now, but we have to build a way to that future. So in my work, this is a raincoat that I made out of a plastic I developed that's made entirely out of marine macroalgae, and I use it to sort of try to draw people in a really accessible, vivid, totally banal, aesthetically way into talking about the role that conventional plastics play in climate change by being made of carbon that was underground and needs to stay underground, and the potential of new materials, new approaches to ecosystems to create materials that can give us a great, beautiful life, but that aren't, that are cycling carbon that's in the biosphere already and potentially drawing it down. So this, because it's made of algae, its physical bonds, the carbon lattice that is that framework of the polymer chain, are all carbons that were taken out of the atmosphere by this wild type macroalgae. So here are some various experiments, also an SEM image. But just to conclude my remarks in thinking about algae and the role that that life has to play in our continued sustainable life, it connects to what Winona was saying yesterday, is that we have an opportunity to think more regeneratively about our lives, the effects of our material culture. This is the photosynthetic activity on the surface of the Earth. So this is, and which is measured by carbon being pulled out of the atmosphere. So in 90 minutes, the Earth is struck by as much energy in sunlight as we use in fuel globally in a year. We have the opportunity to move back into a relationship with sunlight, back into a relationship with carbon that's coherent, that keeps it where we want it to stay and takes it from where we need it to come down out of. And that story that we tell about that potential future isn't necessarily one of sacrifice and repentance and less than. It's a totally different world. It's a new future. And we've talked already about how climate change means change. It just does. And design, I think, and designers have an interesting role, important role to play in casting a vision of that future and doing some of the work to get there. So we've been talking a little bit about language, and it is critical that we get very clear about which carbon, which sunlight we are making our materials out of, because that has impacts on the ways in which our lived culture will cascade into emerged effects. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Andrea Lips. I am an associate curator of contemporary design at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And I beg your pardon, I am fighting back a cold, so I have not had too much of a voice, but hopefully it will sustain itself throughout the duration of my presentation. And what I want to do today is to pull back quite a bit and actually to provide some framing for how we might think about approaching health and materials. And the genesis for this research was the Cooper Hewitt's current design triennial, which is centered on nature. So for those of you who don't know, but hopefully you do, that this is the Cooper Hewitt. We are located on 5th Avenue and 91st Street here in New York, and we are one of 2 Smithsonian museums here in New York. And as a Smithsonian, we are our nation's design museum, and we're the only museum in the country focused on historic and contemporary design. And of course, a triennial focuses on almost the bleeding edge, the most contemporary and forward-looking design that's happening right now. And so I want to just pull back slightly and even talk about what a triennial is. I think that's an important point of departure. So curatorially, we decide upon a theme. This time around, we focused on nature. And we then go into designers' studios and labs and workshops. We attend conferences. We call nominations from an advisory panel. All of this to understand the landscape in which designers are currently working around that theme, and then ultimately define the work that we will select for inclusion. So in the exhibition, my co-curators and I made our selection of work. We begin looking for patterns and themes to emerge, and ultimately what we did was identified a number of strategies that we observed designers employing in their work with nature. And here I want to stress that idea of working with nature, really treating nature as a guide, as a partner, even as a client, which is a critical act. After all, design itself is an incredibly powerful tool to remake and to shape the world that we want to see. Design is intentional. It is the tangible form of our priorities, of our values, of our needs, of our desires. And of course, materials play a significant role as the matter out of which that tangible form is made, is materialized. So one of those strategies we identified was this idea around salvaging nature. So one of the most remarkable aspects about nature is its lack of waste. So decomposition, scavenging, biodegradation are some of nature's processes to maintain a closed loop life cycle. And so designers are redefining raw materials by creatively capturing and repurposing air pollution or ocean plastic, as well as they're developing new methods to work with non-traditional natural materials, which we'll hear more about with Julia's presentation. So for one, of course, a major consequence of human activity that influences air quality is the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so this actually led to a really interesting project and innovation by a designer named Anirudh Sharma. He's based in India. And his idea took hold when some soot from exhaust gases landed on his white t-shirt. And so he thought about this carbon dioxide air pollution, this particulate matter that was in the air, and was thinking about whether that could actually be converted into a black pigment for ink. So he set about collecting that fine particulate matter and purifying it so that ultimately what remains is a pure carbon pigment. And he then started a company called Gravity Labs. And they then are turning that carbon pigment into water-resistant inks that are sold in markers and in pens, which you can see here. And we actually do have some pens for sale in our gift shop at the museum. And even just this small pen, did we decide we don't have a pointer, right? So that small marker pen right there captures approximately 40 minutes of diesel car pollution. The large refill, the 200 milliliter refill there, is made from approximately 830 minutes of diesel car pollution. So it's a really interesting way of kind of intercepting air pollution and turning it into another type of usable product. And an interesting anecdote that Anirudh had shared with us was since he had founded his company and they've continued to try to build out their facilities and their production, he has been discovering that companies who would otherwise be charged to recycle their carbon dioxide particulate matter are actually giving that raw material to his company. So he is actually getting his raw material for free. So he's able to, really find this very unique business proposition, if you will, as a result of working with this material that otherwise people would want to get rid of. So marine plastic, of course, is another detriment to the earth. It clogs our oceans and our waterways, but yet is also something that designers are seeking to repurpose. Parley for the Ocean is an environmental organization that seeks to maintain the health of our oceans. And so to do this, they're partnering with countries like the Maldives, which you actually see here. And they're cleaning up the ocean plastic that inundates their beaches and their waterways. And so Parley then collects the ocean plastic, they pelletize it, they spin it into a recycled polyurethane thread, and then they partner with large global brands like Adidas. And Adidas has actually been using this ocean plastic thread in their sneakers, their Ultra Boost sneakers. And so you see one pair of them. That was the initial pair there on the right. And they have continued to use this thread in other Ultra Boost sneakers. And so they've sold millions of pairs at this point. And a part of the idea is to stop using virgin plastic. For one, that's a key step. It's not to continue making more of it. But then Adidas actually took some of these ideas further, and they've actually spent years and years developing this particular shoe, which is called the Future Craft Loop shoe. And the entire shoe, and meaning the sole, the grommets, the textile upper, everything, are all made from one single material so that the entire shoe can be recycled and remade continuously. So in essence, creating a closed loop, an entirely closed loop system. But one big question for Adidas in the development of this was how to modify consumer behavior to return the shoe for recycling. And so they've been experimenting and talking about a number of different ways they might do this, one of which is a subscription model to the shoe. So once you wear out your shoe, you would send it back to the company, they would recycle it, and you would actually get a new, fresh, clean shoe. So it's experimental, but potentially disruptive, which is really interesting. And, really within this context, we need to consider not just conscious creation, but conscious consumption. And I'm reminded that the etymology of consumer is one who squanders or wastes. So just as much as we need healthier materials, we do need to reframe consumer behavior and a consumer-based economy to accommodate and to demand healthier materials. And perhaps these go hand in hand. So another strategy is simulation, where designers are looking to nature as the ultimate guide. So this is more than even biomimicry or mimicking nature. This is really designers, what we identified, seeking to emulate and even unlock nature's material intelligence. And one example of this is the Agua Hoya project by Neri Oxman and her team at the Mediated Matter Group. They are researching a water-soluble biocomposite material that is derived from chitosan, which is found in shrimp shells to give them their rigidity, and pectin, which is found in fallen leaves and in apples. So the material can be programmed to varied mechanical and optical properties, and it's then 3D printed, which you can see here, using an extrusion method on calibrated machines. And then the generative surface pattern allows for varied stiffness, resiliency, and flexibility. And then those panels have been built into a structure to demonstrate how it can be potentially built at an architectural scale. So you have these varying levels of opacity that kind of makes it glow like amber. And then the decomposition of the material itself can also be programmed such that it can, decompose more quickly or more slowly in the presence of water. So what's interesting about this is that perhaps such research might even lead to a truly environmentally responsive material. Augmentation is another strategy that we identified. Augmentation, of course, yields enhancement. It's about making something greater than it was before. And a completely fascinating discovery that we made was some of the work coming out of the Living Materials Silk Lab at Tufts. So there, the researchers are exploring how fibroin, so fibroin is the structural protein that is found in silkworm cocoons. So they're exploring how extracting that from the silk enables the material to perform in completely unexpected ways, really bridging technological and biological applications. So of course, when we think of silk, we think of it as a textile. But here, the team has made optical lenses, which you can barely see in the top left corner. They make dissolving antenna. Those little screws right there are these tiny little block screws, which are used in facial reconstructive surgeries because they're entirely biocompatible. They can make biosensors, dry drugs. So it's fascinating because more than a material, here silk becomes this collection of functions. So when considering material development, perhaps we need to look no farther than the natural materials at our disposal and really just to push their own capabilities and enhance their functions. And again, I think Julia will tell us a little bit more about that, even with seaweed. So finally, facilitating nature. This is something I love this particular strategy. It's really when designers are harnessing and assisting natural processes. There's cultivation, deposition, proliferation, regeneration of living materials to guide growth. And others are partnering with scientists and engineers to develop new materials and production processes using biological growth as a fabrication platform. Of course, we heard from Ginger all about the biocement bricks. So we did include these in the exhibition as well, and I just have to give a nod to them. Really looking at biological growth as a fabrication platform to dramatically reduce and frankly omit the carbon emissions that are output in traditional brick production by mixing the aggregate, the nutrients, and the microorganisms. Another designer who is also collaborating with microorganisms is Natsai Audrey Chia, and she's doing that to dye textiles. And so what she is doing is using the pigment-producing microbes, such as Streptomyces colocolor, and I'm completely slaughtering that, sorry. And it's a microbe that is naturally found in plant roots. And the textile dyes result in these beautiful colors of reds and blues and purples that can all be controlled through variables such as time and acidity. So Chiesa really uses silk for the most part, and she coats and then submerges that in a bacterial solution for about 7 days in laboratory conditions. And she can create different patterns through targeted bacterial growth by folding, silk screening, twisting, clamping, dipping the textile into the bacterial solution. And then bacterial glitches themselves become these beautiful byproducts of the process. Because really, when we're even thinking about biology, variation and adaptation are completely a part of it. So this process of facilitating bacteria growth to produce pigment to dye textiles offers an alternative to traditional textile dyeing, which is incredibly water intensive and highly polluting. A different and much more passive material approach can be seen in this bamboo theater by Zhu Tiantian, which is a living structure hidden in the mountains of remote China. So Zhu, she is an architect practicing in Beijing, and she was approached by a tourism development agency to create a structure in rural villages that would attract tourists. And after going to some of these villages and considering it, she thought that rather than introduce a completely foreign visual language to these places, it made more sense to really do something that made sense with the local customs and tradition. So in this particular village, she learned how theater was not only critically important to them, but she learned about the Maozhu bamboo of their mountain forest, which is known for its strength and for its resiliency. And the Maozhu bamboo system grows horizontally and interconnects underground. That root system interconnects underground, so it almost acts like a building foundation itself. And then the bamboo shoots grow tall and bend under tension, but they don't break. So the open-air theater then that she created consists entirely of living bamboo stalks that are bent and woven to form this vaulted space. And the structure is maintained by the villagers, and of course the material itself is a material that the villagers are very familiar with. As bamboo shoots die, they can remove them, they can weave in young bamboo shoots, so it very much becomes this lovely act of cultivation, tending to this architecture. And as we think about healthy materials, I would like to leave us with this example, the bleached stools, which are made from wood, loofah, and salt. So to create this stool, the designer Erez Navipana crafts a wooden structure, covers it in loofah, and then submerges the whole thing in the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is so salinous it cannot support most life forms, hence its name. And salt then from the sea crystallizes and solidifies around the structure, and that's it. So Erez then will remove the stool after 2 to 3 months, detaches it from the frame. He doesn't polish it, doesn't sand it, doesn't do anything else to it. I mean, it really is this incredibly passive act allowing for material deposition that celebrates the organicism of this mineral and its growth processes. And I like to end with a stool made primarily of salt, because it's at once natural, and the process to guide it is passive. And I think in many ways it helps us and allows us to consider how highly wrought so many of the materials are that exist in our lives. So the crystalline salt, for instance, from this stool will naturally drop off, and it has been a little bit even in the exhibition. That's just a natural part of what it is made from. So over time, its form will be altered. It is in an active state of change, and that's okay. Perhaps the objects in our lives don't need to maintain this level of perfection and idealism all the time. So the materials in our lives, therefore the objects in our lives, they don't necessarily need to last well beyond our lifetimes. And so how do we lessen our expectation of material lifespans? How can we embrace materials that are more environmentally responsive, whose lifespans are more appropriate for their use? So there are no easy solutions, but designers certainly are pointing ways forward. And I have to say I'm excited to hear now from Julia, whose work is continuing this momentum. Thanks. Okay, thank you.
Wow, great. Let me see whether I can. That's the laser pointer. Yes. It's such an honor to be here, and it's quite hard because I'm the last speaker before the break, and I feel so full with information and with inspiration and with amazement already that you must all probably feel the same. But I hope I can still add something to it, because a lot of the previous speakers have touched on so many of the concepts I really believe in and I really feel we have to tackle. And I'm trying to do this through my work, primarily with seaweed, but yes. So I don't know whether you can read these, but basically, design has fundamentally changed. In our society, it's very hard to solve the current problems we have with yet another chair or yet another object in the same paradigm that brought us here. So we have to, as designers, question what our role is. How can we make the world better? How can we still, in the new paradigm, try to solve some of the issues we are facing in the 21st century? So in this slide, I just put a few of the issues that I think are absolutely paramount design turns to, and design tries to find ways to address them, to highlight them, to ask questions about them, or to find answers. So we have big data, peak everything, transition, the dilemma between being a good consumer and a good citizen, gender, industry 4.0, envisioning futures, nurturing traditional skills, code as material, surveillance state, embodied cognition, and so forth. So how do we do this? And what does this all mean? And I think the real question we're asking is, how can we be human? Like, how can we as humans exist in this world and not end the world as we know it? And I think this is quite a fundamental shift, because no other species had to ask itself that before. It's quite daunting, as the speakers before me pointed out. But it's also quite wonderful that we are able to ask this question, that we are able, through our cognition, to look into the future, to look into the past, to look into the microcosm and into the macrocosm, and to understand so much of the systems that we live in, and then to also have empathy and kind of try and be better in these systems. So Richard Buchanan, who is a US design theoretician, he wrote about the extended frame of design, and I found that really helpful in my own practice. So basically what he says is that this old framing, classical framing of posters and toasters of design, which is primarily looking at how objects are made and signs and symbols, these two very narrow areas of what considers design, has extended into services and interactions. So the questions of how we relate and how we engage with objects, but also with each other and with interfaces and so forth. And then it extended further into transitions and systems, really to try and understand the bigger picture of how our actions shape the world we live in. And to be honest, most of the problems we face today are really unconsidered, unintended consequences of design kind of decisions that we made in previous years but are still making today. So how can we as designers consider our own impact on a more political level and more expanded? So the field of design expanded into these larger systems, but I think what he was missing is it also really expanded into the microcosm. So with the work we've seen before is that we're not looking into the bigger picture only, but we're also not just working with the materials we're given, but we are redesigning materialities. We are shaping DNA, we're shaping molecule chains, we're really looking into the microcosm to also affect our decision-making there. And what that points us to is that no designer can actually deal with this alone. There's so much knowledge interlinking in all these systems that we need to pull into the design process to actually make informed decisions. And then you ask, well, why should a designer do it after all? But I think Aaron was saying it. We are generalists, and we are able to actually synthesize knowledge, to bring together people. This is what we are doing. We are connecting knowledge to human life and to humanity, so we can really act as a bridge builder as designers. So why seaweed? In 2007, I was a designer in residence in Japan, looking at man and marine life, and looking at how we sustain ourselves by pulling things from the sea on a daily basis. And I came across this. And since then, it's been my collaborator, my material, my method, and my muse. So this is just a short one, because I couldn't bring everything here. I was afraid to smuggle it. But I was at the fish market in Sapporo, and I found this material. I was like, wow, what do you make from it? And in that moment, I fully imagined a craft being there that I don't know anything about. And the guys I was with said, nothing, we eat it. And I was like, oh my God, I just imagined it being used for a leather alternative, for raincoats, for book covers, for textiles, for all these things, and you just eat it. Amazing. So then I thought, if this is not an alternative reality, it must be future, and then I must be the one starting to bring it to life. So seaweed is so fascinating because it actually, while it grows, pulls out some of the harmful imbalances, like the farm runoffs, for example, like all the fertilizers that through our riverways get into the ocean. It uses that to grow, and it grows to this shape and to this size, up to 6 meters long, 30 centimeters wide, in just 1 year, in one growth season. So while it grows in many areas, you don't need to fertilize it, you don't need to buy seed, you don't need to, you don't need to have any arable land use of it, but you're actually also hanging it into the ocean, very often over sandy sea bottoms. And when you hang it into an ocean, you're also creating an ecosystem. And you're also kind of creating shelter for fish. You have the ability to improve the ecosystem that you are growing it in a positive way. So I realized that it's not just my material, my method, and my muse, but that I actually want to be like seaweed. That I actually find it so inspiring how something can be so strong and yet yielding so much to the waves, and so resilient, and at the same time really support all the other organisms around it in such an amazing way. So could seaweed help us rebalance marine socio-ecological systems is the question I ask through working with this. And the minute you dive into these kind of concepts as a designer, you suddenly have to understand the notions of localities. So not everywhere are we doing good if we are having a seaweed farm. We have to really address every issue in its own right and look at what the problems are and look at how we, in a way, find ways to medicate or to kind of readdress some of the imbalances we created in these ecosystems. And seaweed are just a wonderful possibility to do this. And it's not the only one. I think mycelium, for example, we heard the biological kind of cellulose and biological, the biocrete, and there are quite a few organisms that have these remedial powers if we find ways to harness them. And what is interesting there is that we have to then, through them, investigate another way of growing them, because it's not just enough to ask where the growing of seaweed does the least harm, or where it can have the biggest economical benefit, but actually where it does the best for the ecosystem. Where is it most helpful to address some of the imbalances to have a seaweed farm? This is in Sweden at the sea farm that I collaborate with, that's been run by KTH Stockholm for the last 5 years, and they've been looking at all the impact assessment and everything, and this is some seaweed, how it's grown and how it's then harvested off that line. So brown kelp has 2 life cycles. One is done in the greenhouse, where it grows to a little plantling, and then it's kind of seeded out onto a rope and hung into the ocean, and afterwards pulled into the boat again. So in 2013, I was at the V&A, and I had the opportunity as part of my PhD at the Royal College of Art to have, for half a year, a residency studio in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is where I founded the Department of Seaweed. So the Victoria and Albert Museum has had departments of textile, silverware, ceramics, and glass. And my Department of Seaweed worked on the notion that seaweed is as important as any of these materials, with the main difference being is that most of what we will have made from seaweed has not been made yet. So whereas the other departments reach a long time into the past and just a little bit into the future, my department was reaching a lot into the future and just a bit into the past. And through this, I then developed ways of how we can use museums to engage with, not just with where we've come from and who we are, but much more where we're going. Where are we heading? And I think museums are such powerful places to do that, because they are not primarily there for commercial reasons. They are set up to bring people together to share knowledge. So this whole idea of we're coming here to share something is really important. And they are there to, they bring together audience who want to learn, who want to engage, who want to better themselves and find out who they are and what they can do with people who might have some ideas and might need also the feedback from lots of other people. So, seaweed. There's possibilities for it to become a textile, and all of you who've looked into textiles, I mean, imagine how much chemicals go into making a textile this size, how much labor goes in and everything. This just grew in the water like that. There's glass. Vegan leather replacement. Parchment. This is laser cut seaweed. I have a sample here as well. I can put these samples there later and then you can touch them. Here I was working with two analogies, basically, because the minute you replace or you kind of change one material to another, so seaweed instead of paper or parchment, you then have to question all the other materials in that mix as well. Why should I make a paravent that then has wood? So I was thinking, well, what are the partners I can partner the seaweed with? And for me, bamboo and seaweed are really related. They both grow very, very long, very quickly. They both are completely attuned to their environment, seaweed being shaped by the waves and by the currents and bamboo by the wind. They both start out dark green and become brown or yellow after time. And they both have very similar properties and very similar ways of many, many forms of how we can use them. So here I just cut the bamboo in slices and combined it with seaweed to make this paravent. Veneer. I really would love to make a yacht interior out of seaweed veneer rather than some hardwood. And this is a method of engagement, I think the most important of them all, because I'm building these kind of structures. This will actually be in MoMA very soon in summer, so you can all go and visit it. This is the Okinagano that you've all gotten to know on the posters, and that's a detail of her. And the reason why I make these forms is because what I was doing in the museum was not creating solutions, but raising a dialogue and asking people to think and co-speculate with me about possible futures. And not about dystopian futures, but about some futures that are actually worth us getting together and trying to achieve. And first I wanted to make a seaweed floor, but then I thought, that's really bad. The seaweed can't say anything about itself. I have to lacquer it, and people will see it and say, oh, seaweed floor, okay. And then stop thinking. So I thought, what is the opposite of a seaweed floor? And it's this. It's a piece that is very associatively rich in terms of seaweed structural properties, in terms of strengths. So you see all the curves that are pulled in here, for example. These are pulled in by the material when it distorts the rattan, which is between these. So between each of the two pieces of rattan, there's one piece of seaweed, and I glue it in there when it's wet. And as it dries, it shrinks by almost 50%, and it pulls the skin very tight. And while it does, it gives it structural strength, basically, as a self-tightening skin. 2 years later, this is how the Okinagano looked, because the chlorophyll, and this links a lot to accepting change in final products. The chlorophyll basically gets degraded by UV light very, very quickly, whereas the fucoxanthin in this type of seaweed, the brown, that stays. So it became really beautifully light. So through my engagement with seaweed, that was my method, through which I investigated and developed this co-speculative design method. in which what we're doing in the museum acts as a lens to have people come together, think together, and discuss possible futures, but not just possible or probable ones, but actually because we're sharing a same set of values, desirable and undesirable ones. So for example, when I looked and I showed some of the seaweed ideas, very early stages, to the phycologist of the Natural History Museum, Juliet Brodie, she said, "Oh." And I said, "What, don't you like it?" And she said, "So many things we looked at as humans and we started using, we messed up so terribly. And I don't doubt we can do so many things with seaweed, but I'm so scared that we mess it up again." So her voice was absolutely invaluable in this very early stage because she looked into the future, and from her vantage point, there was possibilities, but there were also danger zones. And this is the beauty of thinking about futures together, that other people have different vantage points and they can point out things in directions we should not go, and then can point out ones that we should go. So one of the things that people then come and say is like, "Yeah, you make these crazy structures, but could you also make raincoats?" And their challenge. Yeah, so now the Department of Seaweed is collective of people who have similar values or very same values to try and find sustainable ways of using seaweed. So we understand healthy materials as in a material standing between the man-made built world and the natural ecosystem in which it has come from, or from which it has come from. So a healthy material can promote health and should promote health on all levels of kind of where it comes from and where it then goes. So health is also ecosystemic health. It is maybe even not just asking for being neutral, but asking for it to improve the ecosystem in the first stage, and then for looking at what materials have the possibility and the capability of doing this. And I think there we as designers can, or architects can work by then finding uses for these materials so that we can have an incentive to promote more of them. So this is Violaine Bouet, a wonderful textile designer who reached out to me, I don't know, 4 years ago, saying, "Yes, I'm developing seaweed things as well." And then we share knowledge, and now she's part of the Department of Seaweed, and we are kind of working together. So this is in Bretagne, and this is one of her wonderful wovens out of textile, and one of them is also on show in the Cooper Hewitt exhibition. So through the seaweed engagement, I have moved from being this author of the product, of very clearly defined, this is mine, to being a facilitator of a community that comes together to actually try and not just imagine the futures, but try and go the pathway towards implementing them. So if we work in this frame, how do we do it? First, we have to go work across scales of complexity with an ecosystemic mindset. This necessitates a more than human-centric approach with empathy and knowledge, because knowledge alone is not enough. We have to engage, and we have to understand that our ability to change the entire living world for all creatures that are living with us also comes with the responsibility to kind of not do them any harm. That necessitates a transdisciplinary network built on shared aspirations and values. And fourth, combining speculation and collaboration towards transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, Andrea, Julia. That was indeed a rich and inspiring set of presentations. These objects that exude very unique kind of material presence also speak so profoundly and loudly of process and function. I'm struck with the way in which they open up stories. For me, when I was encountering the works, your works and others at the museum, at this show up right now, Nature, For me, the experience was quite cinematic. It even, I'm reminded of the conversation of the last panel where we began to talk about the relationship of science, nature, and design, and I guess even opening that up further around this spectrum of art, design, activism, organizing, social practice, the way in which that movement, especially through narrative, becomes an invitation of kind of, engaging in an active narrative or even an ethical spectacle, and the ways in which that challenges all sorts of notions, including a notion of a future, but also invites us to kind of consider our ways back to a present. So that kind of movement or journeying, that kind of cinematic essence raises for me another element, which is this notion of time and temporality, which keeps coming up. So I'll just kind of throw that out there as a jumping point for any of you to jump in on.
There's a couple pieces there, so I'm going to focus on the imagination piece. Because actually, in terms of my version of the why don't you make a raincoat is like, and when can I buy it? For me, and I'm like, I feel like I have a very similar mission in terms of, I think the important work right now is about creating spaces where we can collectively negotiate around what futures are worth working towards. So the raincoat exists as like a very vivid, relatable, like applied instance of this kind of incredible potential future that's coming with seaweed, but it's not a product for sale at all. Very deliberately, because the kind of work that I feel like I can do as a designer most impactfully as an individual is in this imagination space. And in terms of the cinematic quality of the show, sometimes I call my work nonfiction art, in terms of the work that charismatic objects can do to make a future tangible, relatable. Like, I'm sure this happens to you too, where like, the first thing people want to do is touch it, the second thing they want to do is smell it. They want to like be in that future and have it in their sensorium. And that I think is worthy work in and of itself.
But that's also so important and such a powerful moment, because it also, in a way, connects to people emotionally immediately. Not through intellect, not through, okay, I'm here to learn something, but actually through, oh my God, I didn't smell this for a long time. I walked up to your room and I thought I was smelling seaweed and going nuts, but here it is.
Well, there's some value, right, in being able to experience something as humans, not just like looking at something, but like having it actually like come into and touch our bodies in some way, that there becomes much more, there's a realism that exists within all of it, and at the same time, I do think that even just this idea of narrative and of storytelling is so key to so much of what we do across disciplines, transdisciplinary, antidisciplinary design, all of it, that really it is about narrative and storytelling, and that was one thing which very much always drew us to Charlotte's work was, much more than creating a bioplastic out of algae. It was this narrative about carbon and about our relationship to the sun, which was like, oh my God, yes. And that's, I feel like, such an important part also of what design and designers can give us are, these other ways of thinking about and approaching the world, whether it's an actual shoe or, much more of kind of an imaginative space and way of framing and thinking about things.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for indulging my abstract question, but, because I was actually quite moved in those ways, that the material, certainly it invites us to kind of ponder our present situation, but it's in the process, in the function, that it already exudes, an invitation for, in some ways, how might this kind of democratize, or create in all of us some kind of hacking and participating in this, and that was also very intriguing. I didn't feel this kind of otherness and distance that sometimes is paralyzing in these spaces.
And just to quickly jump on that, that's absolutely, we've been talking today about climate change, and the barrier is not technology at this point, it's political will. And so being able to get that conversation out of oh, it's just for policymakers, we've been waiting for the policymakers for a while, guys. Like, it hasn't worked so far. But how do we make these challenges accessible and make action on them possible, and not just in a guilt-based conscious consumer way, but actually in a there are so many incredible technologies, like biomason is amazing, it's so cool. How do we all be part of supporting the technologies that will be the foundation of the new carbohydrate-based economy that we need to live into?
I think materials are associatively so rich in a way. Because they are not yet an object, they can still be many objects. And then because they are still, at least natural materials, somehow so legible as in their ecosystemic kind of position and where they come from, they still kind of draw our thoughts both into the forest or into the ocean and into the living world. And as such, I think by communicating through them, that allows people to imagine what they become, but it also allows them to imagine where they've come from and what impact they might have had there. And that system thinking that is just happening, and not happening intellectually, but just through engagement with the material, I think is super powerful to then start raising all these topics. And the other thing that happens is, the minute there is no precious object, because we're dealing with a future and with a half-finished material process, there are many other ways of participation a museum can engage with, not just on a curatorial level, but actually on a touching, smelling, tasting, really getting your hands dirty and being involved in process level, which are then really great to explore.
And related to that, and we both brought this up in our presentations, I keep looking at the direction that we are moving and the use of more and more of these types of materials that are non-traditional, whether it's seaweed or salt or whatnot, but even, changing our expectations that, an object in our lives may shift and change and alter, and that's an okay thing. And so I think that, that all of this is very much related to, the materials and all the work that we're doing, but also, on the flip side, the people who end up living with these things and having them in our lives, which of course is all of us as well. And so thinking about, that relationship and how even just our own expectations need to change about the things in our lives.
And some of this gets down to, we're very fond, especially in our ecosystem at the New School and Parsons, of building capacities where we say we're zooming out and we're in those big systems, and then we're kind of wrenching ourselves to kind of zoom back in and be in the tangible, in the moment, in the particular. And I find that kind of dialectic in this particular phase of what is evolving, I remember not that long ago in kind of what we used to call sustainability 1.0, that there was this kind of heaviness and this earnestness and this righteousness and this kind of fixing and the doom and gloom, and there is this kind of tectonic shift and evolution, and I feel that in all of your work. I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Well, the one thing I would definitely say is what we were very intrigued about in curating this particular triennial was a couple of us had also curated the 2010 triennial, which was it was called Why Design Now, and it was themed on environmentally responsible and socially responsible design. So we were looking at sustainability. That was like the big buzzword at that point. So, but what was really interesting then, going back and actually theming it on nature and looking at how designers are working with nature, what we really were finding was almost, much more of a transformative relationship to nature, which I think is very much passing through all of us, and through society at this point, that all of a sudden we are so much more vulnerable than I think we had thought about even years ago.
And again, to all of you, what's next? As we celebrate in these, again, imaginative futures, these really optimistic ethical spectacles that are not about this dystopian doom and gloom or the kind of the finger wagging that was kind of part of those earlier days. What might it mean to come back around and connect it to our present? And where do you see the kind of opportunistic kind of lily pads or steps that are most promising?
I think scale was mentioned a few times, and of course, then the question is like, how do we scale these things up, these interventions, these things? I mean, with the seaweed, it's quite interesting because the seaweed points towards it having to be localized, but the knowledge, like the transfer, the bigger picture of how to work with it can be shared, but it always needs to be a local instance in which it makes sense to grow it, to harvest it, to connect it. And I think that's actually this kind of glocalism in a way is one of the main points to reach. And then I think another really important one is finding ways of sharing knowledge that doesn't scare us. So in a way, this whole idea of a scientific paper very often is signed by like 8 people. So we should find ways of crediting people who work together, because if we all start doing the first step and hide everything in a drawer until we have the patent right, we're not going to make it. So
a gesture of kind of decentralizing authorship and kind of demystifying expertise.
Yeah,
and
maybe
open
creative commons of material development, I think. But it's hard sometimes, because I also got, in a way, copied by somebody who called everyone in the Department of Seaweed saying, can you tell me how this is used and then made a big piece out of it, and suddenly there I get pictures from lots of people saying, look, this looks like yours. I thought it was yours, but it's not. Actually a very famous artist. And then you think, well, there is reasons to be scared, but then there are more reasons to collaborate and to really work. And I found that if people share the same values, it's easy, because then suddenly we are in it for the bigger goal. And it's kind of, we want to achieve the same thing. And if we try in more than one ways, we're going to benefit from each other's expertise.
On that, I would say that in terms of that next step, like fear and finger wagging is real and it's important, but the distinction that I find between fear that produces paralysis and fear that produces action is giving people something that they know they can work on. And there's an enormous amount of work to do in this space. And I imagine a lot of people in this room are designers. Like, even if you're not, any way that you can show up in your communities, in your industries, in your cities, the small-scale interventions have been where leadership has happened so far. If you can show up and be asking questions about carbon, about emissions, about the path that your community is charting on that, that's doing the work, and we all need to be doing the work. And that's more motivating to me than just being afraid, because it already is bad. Like, Australia is on fire right now. So let's get to work.
So there's this notion of kind of almost holding both of these things, or there's an old business term, productive paranoia. Like, well, there's something very motivating about maybe a little bit of this urgency, or a lot of urgency, but at the same time holding these kind of, very inspiring models of ways forward. So it's holding both of those tensions then, perhaps. We have like 30 seconds left. I just want to invite you to make any last comments. Or
I just want to touch on the tectonic comment before and share like a little nugget in case it's fun. The first synthetic plastic was invented in 1907 by Leo Baekeland, and he was trying to emulate the secretions of a beetle. And it's taken us 100 years to get to the point where we can be going back to nature instead of pulling really dumb molecules out of the ground and making really crude materials that cause all kinds of problems. We've already talked about endocrine disruption, but it's a really exciting moment in terms of what the technology is allowing, but also what sensitive, careful, measured, thoughtful approaches to the application of these technologies is allowing.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Julia, Andrea, Charlotte.
Wow, that's amazing. That's like a food enough for lunch, but we do have lunch also. Thank you so much. The Carbon panel feels totally inspired and totally kind of captured by the imagination of the future and wrestling with the fact that we're still living now. We don't have that raincoat yet. We just want to invite you to lunch to continue conversation in the O Cafe, which is across the courtyard where we had a wine reception last night. They have lovely lunch for you available. We will start here promptly at 1 o'clock because we have a busy afternoon, which is also going to be equally as exciting. But just before we do that, I just want to encourage you to browse the exhibitions that are outside this lobby here. And as we talk about the fact that material is not yet an object, there are so many objects yet to come, and that materials can improve an ecosystem, and yet we have to design now, we're designing buildings now, and there are a lot of objects that are already available now that are trying to be healthier in whatever the materials that we have available to us right now. And so I just want to point out a transparency corner that's here, just to my right here, which is a resource collection that's developed by the Jack Dinning at the Dongia Healthier Materials Library, Parsons Dongia Healthy Materials Library. So here you can find a robust materials and certifications, super interesting scorecards that have been developed between the Dongia Healthier Materials Library and Brightworks Sustainability, and kind of scorecarding and harmonizing standards and certifications into one holistic framework. So this is like kind of a brand new tool that is just being prototyped here at my right-hand corner. So I encourage you to come look at this as well. These are some of the top scoring products available in the United States now. And of course, there's a map here if you want to visit the library, which is a few blocks away. Did I leave out anything, Jack? That's good. Good. So I hope you have a good lunch. Please come back here. We have something that's not on the program that's going to be announced at 1 o'clock, which we hope that you'll come back to listen to. Thanks.